Nikos Nightly, and I have several different topics I want to talk about with you tonight. I want to wish you and yours happy holidays, as we will continue to do for the next couple of weeks or so. But in the meantime, before we get through the holidays, we do have some subjects pertaining to the holidays themselves, and I want to make sure you get this information as quickly as we can. So why don't we get right after it? All right, today we're going to be talking about some tips to have a great holiday games day. Now, in all candor, these points will be the same if it was a regular ongoing games event, but this is in particular set up so that it's to remind you, if you haven't hosted an event in a while, some of the things that you can do that will make your event really stand out in the memory of those people that participate. And this is going to talk about the structure of a games evening. There are, after all, hundreds and hundreds of games to choose from. And if you are indeed hosting an event that is games related, of course, I'm very, very supportive of that. And I want to do everything I can to help you have the best event possible. So the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure that you begin your games night with some form of icebreaker. Now, there are a lot of games out there that would fit into the icebreaker category. Generally, you want them to be ones that have a low scoring or non-existent scoring mechanism. You want there to be a lot of open questions and open conversations so that people get to know each other. And even if you are going to use a more static or more familiar game, for example, as apples to apples, or dare I say, cards against somebody, whichever one of those you would like to consider. These are all games that are definitely going to be icebreaker if they leave opportunities for the players to intercommunicate between parts and to be very candid. You want the rule system to be something that's pretty much learn it and get out of the way kind of thing, where you don't have to spend a lot of time revising or checking on the rule mechanisms. So make it sure that you're familiar also with whichever games you're going to be hosting. Of course, games tend to also bring with them the idea of having snacks and drinks, and there are some protocols you might want to consider when you're having snacks and treats at your events, and one of which is to consider drinks that have a closing mechanism, an ability to put a seal or a top on it. So bottles sometimes are preferable to cans or even open glasses, for example. Now, of course, it depends on the level of sophistication of your games group and what you are attempting to portray as far as an image for the group. But the idea here is you want your snacks and your drinks not to interfere with the game or cause difficulties with protection of the game property itself and things like that. I only mention it because it's a big part of one of the nightmare traumas, of course, is that when you're hosting a game, that you'll bring out your favorite game product and then it's going to be subject to destruction by somebody who gets their hands greasy or whatever. So just be aware that you need to take steps to protect your property as far as that's concerned. The next would be you want to scale the games for maximum inclusion. For example, if you've invited 4 to 6 people over, make sure that the games that you have can accept all the way up to 6 players, so that if you do decide to host a game, you're not excluding somebody by just the nature of the property. Now, granted, most games do allow for kind of team play where 2 people could take the position of one, or couples could play against each other or whatever. But just realize that you need to take that into account when you're determining which games you're going to be using. Now, there's a lot that goes into hosting a games event to make it really run smoothly, and one of them is to understand the tempo and duration of a game that you embark on. If you pull out a game, for example, that has a 2 to 4 players, 1 to 1.5 hours, that's a nice encapsulated game period. But if you said you brought out a game that was for 4 players, but it was 3 to 5 hours of playtime, you might run into problems with players either needing to leave early or people who arrive later, therefore don't have anything to do. So just scale the games for maximum inclusion for the groups that you're going to have. Of course, games like we mentioned with the icebreakers are going to be open-ended in terms of players, and they don't necessarily have a duration. So in the case of persons that will be arriving later, whatever, you might want to consider running the icebreaker section a little bit longer or whatever, engaging your start time for your second tier games, if you want to call it that, so that the maximum number of players can be engaged. The next thing is to have an idea of what your game's agenda for the evening will be in advance. Now, sometimes it's difficult if you've got a closet full of games, but you're also a fairly inexperienced host and you're not sure which games last how long. You'll want to do some of this research in advance, almost like a pre-game session, to figure out which games will work together with each other and which ones are going to be able to time out fairly close to each other. So if you need to, you can adapt your schedule of the games so it makes out as well. Now, in doing this, there's some reasons for determining who will be playing first or last in a game, and many of the games that are out there will give a recommendation of the oldest player or the youngest player or the person who owns the game or whatever. Generally, one of the better ways to do it is so that if you're playing especially a time-sensitive game, you will more than likely want the rookies to play last. That way they'll get to see the maximum number of possible turns before it is their turn to act, so they can start to get a feel for how the mechanism works. This process of having the rookies go last not only lets every player provide some input into the sequence and provide the player with enough examples of other people's play that they'll have a fair amount of time before their turn, but it also will provide the other players enough explanation so they feel satisfied that they've been able to help the maximum that they can before the player starts to play. Now, this also means you need to take into account some other things. For example, if you are planning on playing a game that takes a certain amount of space for the board, you obviously want to have the table setups already scheduled. But more importantly, that you'll want to make sure that your seating is set up so that you have positioning at the table, but more importantly, to make sure that your placement is appropriate for the players that you have at the table, because some people may have difficulty reaching across the space or may not have the arm span or whatever to get to the playing pieces. So take all of that into account and obviously place the seating place the play location in optimal positioning for as many players as possible. And another thing you'll want to include when you're looking at having a really good games day is make sure you've got a break schedule in place. Quite often, players that are being taught a new game will feel intimidated. They won't necessarily know how to ask for a break. So if you have it set up so that you'll play one full cycle and then ask everybody's feeling and everything, and give opportunity for getting something to drink or go take care of a bio break or whatever, you can schedule all of that so that it is comfortable for all of your players and also kind of eases their mind as they're going into it. Now, when we talked earlier about game tempo and duration, one thing I didn't specify is that some games will say they've got a range and they may or may not be being altruistic when they give that information, because they may be perhaps they've designed a game that's a little bit longer than their estimated play time, or perhaps it takes a little longer to explain than it would normally take, and therefore that will also break your time schedules. So just realize that having a break schedule lets those times adjust from one session to the next or from one game to the next. Now, generally, there's a structure to your games day event. Perhaps you have your entire group has an affinity for a very crunchy game, and they're ready to dedicate 3 to 5 hours to play a specific game. Well, then certainly you don't want your pre-game sessions, your icebreakers and such, to eat up too much of that time block. Likewise, you may have set up so that you've got several games you'd like to get through in a session, knowing that each one of them is a limited duration and be able to play through them each comfortably. Well, then you need to schedule that and make the players aware of the time frames and saying, okay, we're going to be running an icebreaker for the first half an hour, and then we'll be playing our main game in the case of a crunchy, or we're going to play the first of our 3 games. However you're going to do that, but you want to make sure that the players can really get a feel for what they can expect in the game. And then finally, the game crunch value should be considered. Now, this is a term that's actually relatively young. I suppose I'm probably one of the oldest players to just now be hearing about it, but the idea of a crunchy game is one where the rules are nuanced and there's a lot of details and many caveats and quid pro quos during the game turn sequence, and so therefore there is a protocol that has to be learned before the game can be enjoyed. If you're introducing new players to a game of that level of crunch, then you should be aware that it's going to take considerably longer to play through, and it's going to take a considerable amount of time for the players to actually get a handle on how the game plays. And so really you need to take a good long look at which games you're going to be putting forth for your players, because the time frame might eat up all of the time you intended to have for play, and therefore they wouldn't be able to break out and leave early if they needed to. You also need to consider how much enjoyment a person will have in the first couple of turns of a crunchy game compared to the quicker ramp up to perhaps easier games. So it's just a matter of really getting an idea of who your players are going to be, and of course every game master, every table is going to be different in terms of what the players are capable of or want to do. But just realize that by taking all of these things into account, you can have a great games evening, compress in whatever games you want to, and come away looking like a hero to your players, because they will have had a great session and a great time playing. All right, I get to switch camera angles. I've been trying this for a while. I get this all set up. I think I got it right. So again, happy holidays, and I say great expectations because we all hope this next year is going to be amazing and fascinating, and we're just now starting to consider the things that have gone on in the past year. And one of the things that I would like to suggest is that the concept of being a good guest and a good host at events from here going forward should at least consider some idea of an award or reward for the people who host events. And while I'm not talking about making it so that you have to pay to go to a party, that's not what I'm referring to at all. But what I am suggesting is that acknowledging the hosts and the persons who put forth the effort to put an event together, it goes a great long way to promoting the idea of more events and getting people together more often. So we're going to talk a little bit about perhaps some holiday ideas if you are of a gift-giving culture and your holiday spirit invokes you to want to make purchases and such. These are some quickie ideas that are intended to make it so that you can provide either gifts for your guests in some minor way, or even just simply benefits that they might see as gifts. And likewise, in reverse, if you're going to an event, how you might provide a little something to the people who took the effort to put the games event together, and perhaps even the other participants. And you'll see what I mean in a second. So the first one is some bottle of bubbly. In the season of the at the end of the year, with New Year's celebration right around the corner, and your regular holiday festivities, a little bit of joyous spirit tends to come in a bottle. But I'm going to suggest that the bubbly might be something as simple as one form or another of uh, fizzy apple cider. There are several different brands out there, and I'm not being sponsored by any of them in particular. So these ideas are just one-offs from my concepts, and they're not something that I'm being compensated for. But the idea of a bottle of bubbly, if you've got a group of 3 to 4 people, one bottle might work. If you've got 6 to 10, maybe a couple. But the idea is, even if you're not bringing the only one, if you're aware that other people are doing it, then it's just simply a way of acknowledging the hosts and providing them with a little support for the event. And it's more of a gift of sharing than it is a gift of compensation or awarding them for the effort. The second one is like the reverse. It's when you are a host for games. One of the things you can really do to accommodate, especially a holiday spirit with people who are new and don't know each other, consider the few moments it would take to create paper table tents. The idea would be say a 3x5 card or 5x7 card folded in half. I guess you would say that it's landscape style, laying the card down and then folding it in half creates a small table tent that they can then write their names on. Or if you've got the guest list, why don't you go ahead and pop out the names for them? As a matter of fact, from a festivity standpoint, one host I know of went ahead and put the names of the reindeer on the cards, and then as the participants to the event showed up, they got to pick which of the reindeer they wanted to be. They knew they weren't going to have but 8 or 9 guests, and so they'd made enough for everybody. And I believe, if I remember correctly, they made like 3 or 4 other fake names to add in case more players had shown up. But the idea is that with a name tag, the players can get to know each other better. It eases the transition through your icebreaker games to have names to put with faces and those kind of things. So, and not only that, in terms of the longevity, the idea of having a name tag also provides a way for the players to recall each other in later times. And in certain cases, in my games groups, for example, the players bring their name tag each session so that they can make each other aware of not only their name but their persona name in the roleplay games that I run. The next thing I want to talk about is if you are looking at hosting a games day, then consider some game themed novelties. There are cardboard box fold ups that you can get that are dice of the various sides. Perhaps some of those might be a fun novelty to provide. Or if you've got a relatively large games group, then simply buying each one of them a die is going to be a relatively reasonable expenditure to make them feel special. And in certain cases, there are sites on the web, if you're aware of your event early enough, you can order them in advance to be customized. And so that kind of gives them a feel that there's something special about the event that you're running. Now, beyond that, and going in reverse again, if you're bringing a gift to someone at a party, whether it be the host or maybe the honoree, if it's a party for a certain family or whatever, then bringing game-related accessories, things like dice sets or a simple dice bag, or even just a rolling surface. Find a decent sized cloth piece that would work for that. Providing something like that just as a simple acknowledgement is really kind of awesome. One thing I did a couple of years ago was I created a mouse pad mat that was stylized after the world of Nycos. So it was literally a map, and across the bottom it said, "This is where I want to be," and it had an arrow pointing at the world. And the idea is that you give a callback to the reason why you're getting together, the games that you're liking to play, or the style of play, or whatever. And by doing this, you're giving the players a chance to kind of become a part of the event and feel the integrity of it after the case. Of course, if we're talking about holidays like Christmas or New Year's, bringing along some sort of whiz bang or poppers or kazoos or whistles, these kind of noisemakers make a party just feel more festive. And of course, then there are obviously those that will find a way to make the use of it during the game period poignant and silly, and make it just more lighthearted. So noisemakers or poppers is a great way to go there, especially if you've got ties into, for example, some of the European holiday traditions include the pull poppers and that kind of thing as part of the Christmas spirit during your events. If you are going to be running a series of games, or you have as I do, a relatively large board games collection, then maybe you will provide the other players when they attend with a games list of the games you have, so that you're sharing with them your love of games and showing them some recommendations that they might not already have for properties. One of the biggest challenges in the world is that there's not enough communication in the world of a meaningful nature. Almost all communication is done as a mindless marketing and such. And the idea of having a unique perspective of your experience as a gamer that others can draw against to find new games is a great tool and a resource for them. Not only because they can find out about the game, but more to the point, they're going to have someone that they can call upon if they do get a hold of the game to make sure that they know how to play it and to answer any questions. It's a great interconnectivity tool to have a shared games list that bounces around. The next would be, and this is now going back to the other side, if you're the host and you're wanting to make your event really pop, consider making up coasters. There are companies that will print a coaster or a bunch of coasters within a few days, that if you know when your event is, about a month or so out, you can order coasters or placemats or whatever. And these can be designed specifically to support your property. And in many cases, the manufacturers themselves have the templates for such things, so you can even outreach to your manufacturer the games that you'd like to play and see whether or not they have these kind of resources, or at least the art to help you build them. And these don't have to be expensive. You can print placemats out on your own home color printer if you want, or you can, go to the local print shop, and generally you can get them to put together a pretty good deal and a fairly inexpensive one, especially in this season if you get to them early enough. The idea here is that it's something the players will take home with them and perhaps use again and again, and therefore remind them of how special the games event that you were hosting for that weekend was. And then one of the best is to realize that any party or event that you host is actually an opportunity for a call to action. And so therefore, why don't you just invite the players to a regular games night? Maybe this is a first time get together, but if you're new in the community and this is also a new event, why not suggest it becomes a repeat customer, so to speak, that you'll host it again and again, and therefore start to build a games group. And by doing this, you create more camaraderie, more connection, and more opportunities to play. Now you can see how, as the head of NycosRPG, I would definitely be all about new games events, and with my experience with National Games Week and stuff, it's a great way to get to know people. So, and all of this again leads back to the concept of the National Games Week motto that we talked about last week and yesterday, which is, when you think of gifts, think of games. This is the holiday season. This is the season of giving. If you're going to give Give your targets, your family members, your friends, the gift of something that they can share with others and therefore expand their community circle and perhaps even include you and therefore get some kind of a side benefit out of it. So this concept is that there are great expectations for all of the holiday events you'll be hosting, or indeed any other games event you might host. For more information, check back with me here at NycosRPG, and also the YouTube channel has an entire channel on how to run and administer role-play games. So check that out, the Game Master Academy. All right, let's go on to our next and final. Okay. So this is a question that I get asked a lot, especially from people that walk through the game store there in Redlands, Board Game Paradise, which is my sometime sponsor and very good friend, and the place where I run my live games on Mondays and Tuesdays. But the question is, how many games are there? So I'm going to be using some clever game categories that are kind of my own personal words for them. And others are going to be ones you're going to be able to recognize instantly. So we're going to talk about, this is not a complete list. I have to tell you that if I were going to build a complete list, we would be here for another hour or two just going over all of them. So this is going to be my, if you will, my short list of styles of games. And this does not include any of the role play aspects. I know that normally I'm on the role play channels and talking about RPGs and Dungeons and Dragons and the like. Well, today we're going to be talking about all the other kinds of games that are out there. And this is by far not an extensive list, but it is nonetheless my list. So the first thing I'm going to ask about is how many of you know of any ridimims? And ridimims is an acronym that I came up with, and it kind of describes an entire category of games. Arguably, it's a relatively small category nowadays, but it nonetheless is still found even with new releases year by year. And ridimims are roll your dice, move your mice. Roll your dice and move your mice. Ridimims. So, but a ridimim generally is a game that has a static track, and as you move, you'll have, the closest you'll have to any decisions is the left path or the right path, forward or backward, up or down, simple basic concepts like that. But other than that, the die roll is determining where you land each turn. And in most roll your dice, move your mice games, the dynamic that causes the game's changes is when a choice you make puts you in a place where the course you were going to take changes. Chutes and ladders is a great example. Snakes and ladders, I guess, is another name for it. There are dozens and dozens. Candyland is a prime example. And some would argue that Monopoly is, but it's not quite. We'll get to Monopoly in a minute. So I wouldn't consider Monopoly to be a ridimim, because the decision-making structure in that case is considerably different from just rolling the dice and then watching where the dice move your figure to. There are some places on the Monopoly board where there is, but generally speaking, you don't have a lot of control. So the next kind of game are chases. And there are a surprisingly large number of chases, even if you're not aware that's what they are. The concept of a chase is found in simple games like Sorry or Trouble or Parcheesi, which are all three fundamentally the same game with slightly different rules. Or even arguably simpler games that use multi-piece moving, such as checkers or Chinese checkers, both of which are you're attempting to transit a board from one side to the other, ostensibly to achieve victory, or at least in the case of checkers, to achieve a superior status for your playing pieces. But a chase game is generally you have a static number of moves that can be made, and the order in which you make them will determine the winner of the overall game session. Both of these are generally on the basic end of games, and many of them are ones that by the time you get to junior high and high school, you've evolved, if you will, past them. But some of them can still be, don't get me wrong, they still can be fun, and there are longer versions of chase games that are still out there. One of my favorites is a game called Mille Bornes, which means 1,000 miles, and it's a French card game. Static number of cards, but you're trying to travel a distance of 1,000 miles. And while it does have some of the more competitive aspects to it, generally speaking, it really is literally still just a chase game. You're just going from one point to the other. Sometimes there are games that have a chase and pursuit aspect. I believe that Sorry is the one that has that. And then there are others that have a move and block chase kind of an element, and I suppose you would consider backgammon to be a multi-piece movement version of that. But all three of those that I've just mentioned, chess, checkers, checkers, Sorry, and such, are also considered to be what I consider to be the hallmark of homeroom classics. When I was in school, at least, and this is, granted back before the invention of the light bulb, but the days of the school homeroom was that there were certain games that were privileged to be included in the schoolroom that could be accessed during study periods or whatever. And these included chess, checkers, sometimes backgammon. The concept here is that they are two-player games because generally only one or two people are going to be free in the study hall. And it became a privilege to be able to participate in these. And the idea of the homeroom classic are just those games they're like the equivalent of what comfort food is to diet. They make us feel good, and they are ones that are familiar to us. The rules are relatively simplistic to understand, although obviously complex to master in the case of chess. But the numeric dynamics of the play is promoting educational mental processing, and so therefore schools will generally endeavor to have them available. And they are usually classic in that they don't have a branding or a license or intellectual property. They're just playing pieces in a board. Now, the next group are what I call colloquial favorites. And the reason why I say colloquial is that the same game might have 20 names. I remember when I was a youngster, there was a game that my parents had picked up someplace, and they used what was for us a dirty word when they played the game. It was called spit, for lack of the actual word. And spit was a game where you played, basically each person was attempting to complete a solitaire puzzle and run themselves out of a stack of 13 cards. And the first person out would catch the others with a number of points in their hands equal to the number of cards still in their pile of 13, which they would then have to subtract from the total number of cards they'd played on the table. I'm giving away too much information, but the idea is that these games are colloquial. They're usually quick play. They're usually not necessarily icebreaker because they generally don't have a lot of text. Conversation is part of the game, but they certainly allow for some smack talk and messing with other players and such. And so they are dynamic and usually frenetic in nature. This would also include, I think that now there's a nationally known name of Farkle, but that was called Five Spot, and a bunch of other names in the years when I was growing up. And these were games that were, I consider them colloquial only because the names were colloquial. The games spread quickly from neighborhood to neighborhood, but they were, well, no, I just reversed myself. Let me back up. This is Wildfire games. I was ahead of myself. So these are the Wildfire games. They don't necessarily have the same name as you go from place to place. They are quick to learn, quick to play. A lot of fun, mechanical, dynamic, challenging, but they don't have a lot of history. And what history they do have will have different names and different terms for it. So now I'm going to go back to colloquial favorites. And when I refer to colloquial favorites, I'm talking about those games that are time-honored, our families have known for years. They might have different names for them depending on where they grew up. Games like Standard Rummy, Gin Rummy, Shanghai Rummy, Chicago Rummy. There are alternative forms of bridge such as pitch or pinochle, or numerical games like my personal favorite, cribbage, euchre, whist. There's hundreds of games, and they are generally played with a similar or the same set of cards, and the players, once they learn the system, they can play version after version after version. And generally these are, when I say again colloquial, they become a part of the local fabric. In the case of my parents coming from the Midwest, the 3 C's. I said 3 and there's 2 I couldn't think of. That's funny. Cribbage, canasta, Kings in the Corners. There's literally dozens and dozens. At one point I knew 127 different card games to play, but many of them, to be honest, were games that had only slight nuanced rules and were fundamentally the same. For example, Shanghai versus Chicago Rummy. They're played with the same concept of a progressive objective in scoring, and the only difference between them is the rate of change and the overall points. So I could call it 2 different games I know how to play, but it's really the same fundamental game. These colloquial favorites they can be in any format. So perhaps it's card games, perhaps it's miniatures, little soldiers. It could be marbles. It could be games like Mancala, where you just dig holes in the ground. These are all colloquial games. As a matter of fact, things like bag toss, bags, whatever they call it in North. The idea of throwing a sandbag, a bean bag through a hole at the other end of a course or whatever. These are all colloquial games, and they are all enjoyable. They play out in 5 to 15 minutes, and you can move on to the next game. And they are basically loved by the locals to that particular style of play. The next are the war game starters, and there are less of these days than there were before. But a war game starter is that 1 or 2 of those games that are out there, such as Risk or Stratego, that teach the abstract concepts of military warfare in a competitive but sanitary way. The mechanism of the game is not glorifying in any way the machinations of warfare, but they are representing the sweeping changes to the world that occur because of them. And Stratego is much more of a espionage side of warfare, but nonetheless it is still the concept of us versus them. It's fundamentally 2 to 4 to maybe 6 players competing for world domination. In the case of Stratego, specifically 2. But the idea of the war game starters is there was an entire generation of games in the 1960s that spawned from our military successes in World War II, and how they translated the mechanistic means of winning that war into game mechanics. The simpler versions, as I said, are Risk or Stratego, but there are many more, slightly more sophisticated ones, such as Attack or, oh gosh, what's the other one? There's a lot. World in Flames, if you're looking at a miniatures property that is also a beginning war game. Axis and Allies, that was the other one. Axis and Allies is a kind of a grown-up brother to Risk. So these are, even though the level of Axis and Allies is considerably more sophisticated than Risk, nonetheless, it is still a starter compared to much more sophisticated war games, such as Atlantic Wall or Cross of Iron, or no, there's dozens and dozens. But the starters themselves are lighter fare, and you're more likely to run into those in the localized area. The next kind of games are ones that we talked about just a moment ago, and these are the icebreakers. These are generally games where the players interact and share information about the games, about themselves while they're playing. So you learn a little bit about the personality, you learn about their sense of humor, you learn a little bit about maybe where they're from, and this kind of things as all part of the concept of breaking the ice or getting to know each other a little bit. And therefore they are usually fairly short. You're talking 15 minutes to an hour maximum to play through one of the icebreakers, usually less than that, and they're therefore repeatable. You can play them more than once just to get familiarized with each other and the rules and the propriety of how to play games. Beyond this, you also have I need to know if you've ever played any simulators. And most people would think simulators means I'm talking about a computer program that's going to emulate something in real life. And no, in this case, the simulation game is one where the rules are intentionally arbitrary and that the play is defined. Therefore, the players don't have a lot of agency. And a great example of this is the game Monopoly. Most of us have played it, didn't realize it was a simulation compared to a game, because it does create some semblance of life, but in reality, we don't, other than metaphorically, we don't walk around in a circle, and yet the Monopoly board is just that. It's simply a squared out circle, and therefore you are hitting the same specific places time and again, without any control on your part, and therefore there's no real agency to it, and thus it's an economic simulator with some fallacies built in. The lore on it, I could go into it at a later time, but the lore of Monopoly is such that it's intended to prove that capitalism is bad and that people who have to win at Monopoly are jerks, and that capitalism just is a failed experiment. But we'll deal with that later. There are other simulator games out there. Game of Life. There are several rhythms that are like them as well, where you're following a path, but you get to choose direction. And Life has a little bit of that, and games like Barbie, there's several other different board games that have this mechanism that actually are just a simulator for some economic structure or some communications engine. Now, the next category is probably one of the largest, and these are party games. And a party game is something that's going to take between 30 minutes and an hour and a half, and is going to be playable by 4 to 6 to even 10 players. And it's going to pit them team versus team with some skill involved, whether it be memory, whether it be drawing for example, like in Pictionary, or maybe it's based on nimbleness. All of these types of party games are meant to just be a lot of fun with a large group of people. The score isn't supposed to have as much meaning. It isn't going to determine how you feel about the night, whether you won or lost at the party game. And because of the fact that it does have to do with skill, you can somewhat admire the people that do succeed in the game. And if that's you, awesome. And if it isn't, awesome. It's whoever had the best skill at that moment. And party games also tend to be short enough that in a average get-together, you can play anywhere between 2 and 5 party games. They aren't crunchy, they're not clunky, the rules are quick to pick up, and you're just able to get going right away. Of course, then when people think of party games, they think of partying, and so therefore, of course, there is an entire subsection of games known as drinking games. And generally, these are ones that give specific rules for when you must drink, so to speak, in a competition, or in other cases, you have to refrain from drinking while somebody else has to, and so therefore it's a way to give yourself permission for some level of inebriation. Now, I tell you that I like a lot of the drinking games, but I almost always play them with a different set of rules and no alcohol. We play instead that we play until you have to be the first one to run to the bathroom, and then the game's over when the first person has to go running. So that can be fun too. If you sat there and drank, you have now imbibed your third Mountain Dew, and your parents told you only 2. And yes, so drinking games among youngsters, if they're using alternate rules where it has no alcohol in it, they're a lot of fun. But adults, within reason, of course, can enjoy adult beverages and have a great time with drinking games. There are some of them that are pretty racy and have a lot of innuendo and nuance and things like that draw the players in for more of a visceral play experience. So I'm not going to go into them in particular detail, but then we get to what I call the big two. And the big two are main attractions and crunchy marathons. A main attraction game is a medium crunchiness 2 to 4 hour board game. These are what everybody came to play. If you have seen games, there are names out there like Wingspan and Scythe and 100 and others that are out on Kickstarter that are dropping all the time, and these board games tend to be on the moderately crunchy level. They have some serious visual appeal, either by having miniatures or having terrain or map features. They're all usually well designed and well made, but they do have a longer playish time, and that longer time does preclude other games. And that's why they're considered to be the main attraction. If you're getting together to play a game of Scythe, it's a 4 or 5 hour game, so you're not going to be playing that and something else. You're going to be, getting right to business as quickly as you can. And then finally, the really big monsters are known as crunchy marathons. And this is modern terminology, and I'm old, so I'm probably going to be castigated for my terms here. But the idea here of a crunchy game session is that it is a game that has a large number of rules, generally with considerable nuance. It does take a lot of discussion and a decent player knowledge base that the consumer has to go through, and therefore the idea of a crunchy marathon is it's going to be 4 to 6 to 10 hours to play through, and so you don't undertake one of these at a whim. And so once you start to understand what games are out there and what the terms mean and what the game represents, you can choose appropriately for whatever game event you're hosting, so that your players will feel a part of the community and they'll understand going into it what they can expect from your game sessions. So that is the 3 sections that I wanted to get through for today. I'm getting done about the same time, about 44 minutes. So that is great. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to reach me through the chat box here in Facebook during the hours that I'm here, or, of course, over at YouTube in the comments section. We are at NycosRPG in both cases. So just use go to either one and search at NycosRPG, and you'll be able to find us, so you can watch the videos and whatever. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, make sure that you follow this channel here on Twitch and like the channel over at YouTube, so that we can keep giving this information to more people and the audience can find us. If you have any other questions, of course, you can PM them to me directly, and let me share with you our other information. If you want to know more about the NycosRPG mechanism itself, you can check out the product info and more at NycosRPG.com. Also over at NycosRPG.info is the story, lore, and game information about the campaigns that I run each week in roleplay games. I'm currently up to 7 game sessions per week, so that's a lot of fun and quite exciting. You also will want to join our roleplay revolution by clicking on the Discord link down below and becoming part of our community. There you can learn about the properties, follow the news on the various games groups, and get a chance to chat with me in the times between my shows. We do a games event on Saturdays for members of Discord, and then we also have our Sunday game for our Patreon supporters. So if you want to be part of a very narrow band group, we have a custom group on Sunday at 1 p.m. and you can join that by joining the Patreon program at the $20 levels. And I want to thank you for taking a look at all of this. If you have more questions, let me know at any time. I'm Jonathan Albin, Game Master J, and this has been Nykos Nightly. Have a good evening.